Hey, so welcome to part two of How to Beat the Patriarchy. And today I just want to focus on how patriarchy is a social construct, to unpack that a little bit, but to recognize that, there are alternatives that actually aren't that far away. So, the kind of basic outline is that really patriarchy is a system that has been reinforced by the rise of monotheism, which is religions that follow a single male god. So that's really come around in the last couple of millennia, and that is really the kind of the core of the belief system of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So there's a huge influence from that, which is relevant to patriarchy because those three religions were cornerstones to really modern democracy. So there's a lot to kind of to bear in mind around that. It's not a coincidence that the major religions believe that there is one male god, because you know that is really the kind of basis for patriarchy. So if you can look at it in those terms and go, okay, well that makes sense because that coincides with the impact that that's had on society. But also, if you can sort of recognize that in terms of the relationship between religion and patriarchy, then you can see how, prior to a couple of thousand years ago, societies did not operate in the same way. Obviously it's difficult to compare because we are talking about totally different sort of environments, and if you can't really apply it in terms of economics. But what you can look to is how we interacted as societies, how we lived, prior to the rise of monotheism. And in order to find out, all we really have to do is look to indigenous populations, many of which are still around and continuing their heritage. For example, the Zuni are an indigenous tribe who live in New Mexico. They believe that there are three genders. They also believe in maternal or matriarchal lineage and women holding positions of power in the community. As a community themselves, they recognize individuality, they recognize diversity, they've held on to their own spiritual connection to the land, and they recognize the importance of balance. Now, these are similar themes to many other indigenous tribal populations all over the world and back through history. And this is really the template for how human society lived for millennia before the emergence of the idea of a single God religion. So that kind of gives you an idea for the basis of patriarchy, how there is an alternative that was working prior to the rise of patriarchy, but also that there are, throughout history, there have been points, there have been sort of milestones where we have seen that kind of positioning of the people with resources and wealth at the top continuing to hold those positions. And it has just evolved. That's the only way that I can describe it. And we see it playing out in the White House. We see it playing out with the rise of fascism and authoritarianism. It's important to remember that fascism and authoritarianism are very close friends with patriarchy. And the importance of intersectionality cannot be overstated because it all is part of the same picture. You cannot recognize the injustices caused by inequality if you don't recognize how we are all impacted by discrimination in our own ways because of who we are. intersectionality is a really important part of this, and it's it's not really kind of, it doesn't do it justice to sort of mention it as an add-on. Intersectionality runs through everything that I talk about around feminism and patriarchy. And for those of you who don't know, intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, where she recognized how different social and political identities always affect us. So this includes race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. It means that we have a unique, each of us has a unique experience of discrimination and conversely privilege. So you can't separate any of this. All of these types of oppression are intertwined, and that's why it's really important to recognise fascism and authoritarianism in this. You know, if you think about the types of community and population I was mentioning at the beginning, where there is cooperation and community and individuality and creativity, that is the complete antithesis of authoritarianism. And they both require some sort of buy-in from the population for them to work. So, you know, then the question is, well, where do we go from here? We can see that there is a model of more community led solutions. You know, I've worked in the nonprofit sector for a long time. Clearly, that is a sector that has been innovative and worked on ways to really harness the power of community. That's what it's been about. You know, during COVID, that sector was really effective in mobilizing where other bigger organizations were kind of stumbling around. The idea of community taking charge and mobilizing has grown over the last 5 to 10 years for a number of different reasons. But it is possible to think of how to integrate this approach more effectively in our kind of modern way of living. Iceland have almost achieved 50% representation of women in government as I think parliamentary representatives. You know, Scandinavian countries are seen in many ways as being, you know, scoring the highest on the sort of indices that you want for your population, like happiness scores, for example. They are always sort of cited as the nations that recognise the challenges that individuals face. So they have better maternity packages, they have better ways of working, they're more flexible. All of these things are seen as being a way to look to the future. But they meet with such resistance. And that is because of a fear of change. It's a fear of upending the status quo. It comes back to this idea of anything that isn't patriarchy is just chaos. And it's not true. And we know it's not true. And the reality of making any changes towards it is that it starts with us. And this is where I really strongly believe this, that if you're kind of concerned about global issues, global events, what's happening in your community, what's happening outside of you, and you're feeling powerless, all of the people that made the greatest change or changes in human history had to start with an idea. But they didn't finish it on their own. They built a movement. You can be part of a movement. You can be part of something bigger than yourself. And now more than ever, you have way more opportunities to do that in terms of access to the internet, social media. The way in which we communicate has exploded. So you must think about starting with yourself. If you want to beat the patriarchy in any meaningful way, it starts with how you look after yourself, the compassion that you show yourself, being aligned with your values, and using that as your North Star. it really is important to start with yourself. And you only have to look to people like Rosa Parks, Angela Davis, people who are and were inspirational. They recognize that they had to invest in themselves and take care of themselves. And that is really important when we're battling the kind of levels of adversity that we face right now. It starts with showing ourselves compassion and supporting one another. So that's just some food for thought around how we got here, where we are, just a little bit of an overview without going into too much detail, but also a kind of a blueprint towards what is possible, that it doesn't have to be more of the same, and that we've seen different types of regime rise and fall before. But I think there is a strong argument that patriarchy is getting to the point where it's starting to show the cracks. And I'll talk about that more next time. So for now, thanks for watching. Please subscribe, share, and like, and follow for more content.